Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My talk today will be about Andalus, Muslim Spain. It will consist mainly in talking about three main aspects of Muslim history in Spain. First of all, I will tell you a bit, or I'll try to sum up the history of Spain from the time the Muslims reached Spain until the time when the expression is they were expelled in 1609, 1610. That will be, inshallah, the first part. The second part will be about how the Muslims and Christians and Jews lived side by side in Al-Andalus and the exchanges and the tolerant aspects of Muslims and Muslim civilization. And the third and final part will be about the exchange of ideas and how Muslim learning was transferred to the Christian West from mainly Al-Andalus, although there were other points of contacts in the East and other places, Sicily and so on. I will not talk too long because I would rather leave most of the time to discussion, because I'll try to raise some issues in relation to tolerance and accepting and living with the other and exchanging sciences and learning between faiths and so on, rather than me going on for 40 minutes or so, which I think would be too much. So I try to keep it long, but I would give, inshallah, the discussion the bulk of the time, inshallah. So I would like to begin, first of all, with a short history of Al-Andalus. The Muslims entered Spain at the beginning of the 8th century. I know other people are aware of the first Muslim general, Tariq ibn Ziyad, who came from North Africa and who led the Muslim armies and so on into some of the greatest victories. And then the Muslims went through Spain, conquering towns and cities in after swift battles. Anyway, by the end of, or we could say even by the middle of the 8th century, Spain was in Muslim hands. There was another Muslim general, Musa ibn Nusayr, who followed Tariq ibn Ziyad. The first rule in Spain, Muslim rule in Spain, the best known Muslim rule in Spain was that of the Umayyads. The Umayyads, many people would think they are Syrians, and they were extinguished in Syria. What happened was, when the Umayyads were extinguished in Syria in 751, one of their descendants went to Spain, escaped to Spain, and began Umayyad rule there. And so you had the famous Abdurrahman 1, 2, 3, and so on. Umayyad rule lasted, we'll talk about some of the accomplishments of Umayyad rule a bit later on. Umayyad rule ended towards the end, or we could say the 10th century. But the 10th century, at the end of the 10th century, the Umayyad heir was a little boy, Hisham, and he needed somebody, a vizier, to look after the little boy and to rule Spain in his name. And that man was the future Al-Mansur, Ibn Arabi. And Al-Mansur became the ruler of Al-Andalus, and he was very famous, Al-Mansur, for all his accomplishments, again, like other Umayyad rulers in economic and civilization terms and so on. Al-Mansur died early in the 11th century, and he was replaced by his son, or he was succeeded by his son, who wasn't as successful. And this is something that happened that's very crucial to the history of Spain. Muslim Spain broke into over 30 states, what's known as reyes of Taifa. So 30 independent states, whereby Ishbilia, Cordoba, Valencia, and other parts of Spain, Toledo and so on, were ruled by local rulers, and they were independent from each other and also at war with each other. The wars between the Muslims in Spain led to the Christian intervention from the north, because the Christians knew now what was the best time, because before there were interventions, but the United Spain was able to respond. So when the Muslim rule broke into these 30 independent states fighting each other, then you had the beginning or the intensification of northern invasions from France, mainly manpower came from France, the knights crossed France and came to fight in Spain and so on, in the name of Christianity. And this is when the Muslims began to have the first reverses in Spain and losing their major strongholds. They lost a place, one of their biggest losses, earliest losses, was a place called Barbastro in 1063, and it would have a big impact on the advance of civilization in the Christian West. The other most important loss was that of Toledo. Toledo was again to play the central role in the transfer of Muslim science to the West, as we will see inshallah later on. Toledo was lost in 1085. As the Christian threat mounted, the reyes of the Taifas, the rulers, the local rulers, became worried, and they knew that their kingdoms were going to be destroyed and swallowed. So then they called the Moroccans. The Moroccans, there was a dynasty there called the Almoravid, Al-Murabitun in Morocco. The king of Ishbilia, Al-Mu'tamid, traveled to Morocco, and he asked the leader of the Al-Murabitun, the Almoravids, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, to intervene to save Muslim Spain. So the Almoravids came in and pushed back the Christian invaders and preserved the unity of Muslims. And they eliminated the race, the Taifas, the 30 or so republics, and they installed one united Muslim Spain. However, Almoravid rule weakened gradually, and then they were replaced by the Almohads, Al-Muwahhidun, who came again in 1147, and they took over Almoravid rule and united again the Muslim world. They preserved Muslim Spain, or the unity, fighting back Christian invasions until the defeat of 1212, called the Battle of Avas de Tolosa. It was a very important battle which the Muslims lost, and the Muslim armies were crushed in that battle, and that signaled the end. In fact, the Muslim historian Al-Makkari, future historian, he speaks that the Muslim armies lost up to 600,000 men, which was a disaster for the Muslim world, for the Western Muslim world, and that was signaled the end of power in the Muslim West, because the armies of both North Africa and Spain were engaged there. Anyway, following that loss, the Muslims lost their main strongholds. In fact, most of Al-Andalus. Lots of people think that Al-Andalus was lost in 1492. This is a mistake, common mistake that lots of people make. Granada, which was the last enclave of Muslim presence, it's a southern part of Al-Andalus, that was lost in 1492. But the whole of Al-Andalus, the three-quarter, or we could say even four-fifths of Al-Andalus, was lost in the 13th century. Great cities such as Valencia, Seville, Cordoba, Murcia, Jaén, the Balearic Islands, and so on. This is when Muslim power was broken in the West. So all these cities were lost between the years 1236 and 1260 something, 65 and so on. So some of them were lost gradually, some others completely. Anyway, by the late 13th century, the Muslims had lost Al-Andalus. And that came after the Muslims had suffered losses in the Crusade, during the Crusades, because the Crusades were going on at the time. So these were also terrible losses for the Muslims, although they regained gradually the lost territories. And Sicily, which also used to be Muslim, was also lost at the same time as Toledo earlier on in the 11th century. So anyway, by 13th century, Muslim power in Al-Andalus was spent. They kept, as I said, Granada. Now, Granada stayed there independent because the Granadans had these alliances with Christian kingdoms for some time. But in 1480s, the Christian armies again wanted to, having sorted out problems between the division between Christians, decided to regain the whole of Spain, and they attacked this enclave, and they took Malaga and the regions, and then in the end Granada fell in 1492, the year the Spaniard, or Columbus as they say, discovered America. So it's this date 1492 is a great shift in history, whereby once the Muslims lost their last outpost in Europe, the Westerners discovered or began to establish themselves in the Americas. That's in 1492. Now, there was a Muslim presence in Spain that lasted because the Muslims were kept. At the time, the expertise came from the Muslims. If, say, buildings or agriculture or industry or anything, crafts and so on, even armament, it's the Muslims who had those crafts. So the Muslims who had crafts were kept, although Muslim scholarship was distinguished. Otherwise, you see, I will return to this, inshallah, later on, or maybe when we discuss. But Muslim craftsmen in particular were highly appreciated because they were the people who were then educated the Christian West in every sort of craft. If you talk, for instance, about faience or techniques of irrigation, on some armament techniques, castle fortifications, and so on, all these were in Muslim hands. Anyway, the Muslim presence continued then until the year 1609, or the year 1609, 1610, when the Muslims were finally expelled from Spain. Now, this is what generally we know about in history. People would give different figures. Some would say 3 million, some would say 500,000. There are great disputes here, and because we don't have the adequate scholarship that deals with these issues now, or that look into history and its distortions and that tries to understand Muslim history precisely, no Muslim really. There is a brother called Ahmed Thompson. Rahim, they did good work. Muslim, they did something on Andalus, which is good. But we need also something that's good. But we need something bigger. We need Muslim history to be studied in more details, longer, at length, so that we understand what happened to the millions of Muslims. There are even figures which speak at some time of 30 million Muslims in Spain, because Spain used to be a Muslim country. So if you say you have a minimum of 5 million and a maximum of 30 million. But the figures of the expelled Muslims, some historians speak of 300,000, some say 500,000, some do mention the figure of 3 million. But where have the other millions of Muslims gone? There haven't been any convincing study to tell where. So anyway, by 1609, 1610, as I said, this was the end of the Muslim presence in Spain and of Islam. So many of the Muslims expelled went to North Africa or to Turkey, to Constantinople and so on, where they were resettled and so on. Many had their children taken from them. We might go back into this later on when we talk about tolerance and living with the other and so on. So this is more or less brief history of Muslim Spain. Now, in relation to the second point, the cohabitation together. I can't go on again for hours about this, but Muslim Spain offered something that was remarkable at the time. For the first time in history, and this is what's great about Muslim civilization, is the cohabitation of various faiths and groups under the umbrella of Islam. Today, we are being accused of being intolerant and this and that, but when you look into our history, you will find that it's the reverse picture of what we are accused of. In fact, if you look into the the works by some historians, they will demonstrate to you, not just Muslim historians, a couple of Western historians of the old generations, they demonstrate to you that tolerance and living with the other were borrowed from the Muslims, of course from Spain, but also from Sicily and during the Crusades. And if I'm talking about the Crusades, for instance, without dwelling on it too much or too long, otherwise we'll lose the track on the thing. When the Crusaders came to the land of Islam, they mass slaughtered the Muslims in their millions. However, there were some Crusaders who stayed there, and they learned to live with the Muslims, and they changed, and they became affected, or they had an impact by the Muslims on how to behave, on how to use baths, on how to dress, and plus the impact on various aspects of civilization and sciences and so on. And many historians, modern historians, they accused, or even earlier Crusaders, they accused those Crusaders of having turned effeminate. Why? Because they had become as tolerant and as kind as Muslims, and they started taking baths like Muslims, and their wives started to go and have baths like Muslim wives and so on. And they had bath time for women and men and so on. They started dressing like Muslims. They had cooks, Muslim cooks and so on. Things which we deal with in a book somewhere. I'm not going to advertise it now. But anyway, you have lots of instances whereby the Crusaders were affected by what they saw and lived and experienced in the East. And there is a very good Muslim historian called Usama ibn Munqid, and he talks about these older Crusaders who came to the Muslim world, and they started to behave differently from the new Crusaders. So when the new Crusaders arrived, they didn't understand what the others, they say, what's wrong with these people? They have turned Muslim, like women, this and that, and wearing nice clothes, sleeping in beds with sheets and covering themselves, putting on perfumes and so on. Anyway, but the concept of tolerance itself was acquired from the Muslims. It's there in the East where the Crusaders who came to slaughter first learned the first basic point, that you can live with the other, because they also found Christian Arabs living with Muslims for centuries, and they couldn't understand. That was to them a shock. Because at the time you couldn't imagine Christianity and Islam surviving, or Jews. They found also Jews there in huge numbers with their synagogues and so on. In fact, the Jews paid a high price when the Crusaders took Jerusalem, because they were slaughtered alongside the Muslims. Anyway, but the Crusaders gradually learned this concept. But to return to Spain, the Muslims were in Spain for centuries. When later on, as I mentioned earlier on, the Christian armies entered Spain and took cities from the Muslims, Cordoba, and they found the Christians with their churches and their priests and so on. And that's what taught them later on, the Spaniards in particular, to tolerate the Muslims and to allow them to stay there for centuries, although it was mixed tolerance. We might again return to this sort of tolerance later on. But for centuries, Christians and Jews prospered in the Islamic State. And this is wonderful, again, something that you won't find today, and that's what's also remarkable about Islamic civilization. The Crusaders were slaughtering the Muslims in the East, in their millions, literally, during the 2 centuries. The Muslims were killed by Christian armies attacking Spain, and yet the Muslims never took revenge, either towards. Of course, there were some possible agitations or denunciations of those who collaborated with the Christian armies, but the Muslims didn't take the step to wipe out or to remove Christian minorities amongst them, whether in the East during the Crusades or during the so-called Reconquista in Spain, when the Spanish. And this is something remarkable in the Middle Ages, and that gives you an idea of how tolerant the Islamic State was. On the contrary, minorities were protected even at the worst time when Muslims were absolutely butchered in their hundreds of thousands. Now, this thing, you find this aspect, not just they were safe, they prospered. And you have, for instance, the ministers who occupied high positions in Muslim governments. You look, for instance, today, you have a Muslim MP in parliament, and there is so much big fuss about it. And generally, maybe, I don't blame everybody, but some of them would have to literally listen to the prime minister and repeat what he says to be accepted. At the time, you had Christian and Jewish ministers in Muslim governments in the medieval time, and they reached very, very powerful and decisive positions. You take wealth. Most wealth, banks and other industries were in Jewish hands. And no Muslim ever wanted to remove these people because they had the wealth of the country. Some of the caliphs, especially in Baghdad, did entrust their, also in the West, they even entrusted their best or most precious belongings and documents and even prisoners to Jewish guardianship. So that gives you an idea. Scholarship, our civilization, Islamic civilization was and remains truly the single multicultural civilization that ever existed, because everybody was judged on their merit, regardless of their origins. And imagine in the Middle Ages, you have Christians and Jewish doctors who were heading hospitals, whether in the East or the West, and attaining very high positions, being in control of many scientific endeavors and many powerful institutions. And this, again, is a remarkable fact about Islamic life. And I repeat again, even when Muslim blood was absolutely streaming, because you have to read about the Crusades, for instance, or you have to read about when the Christians took cities such as Cordoba and Seville, what was inflicted on the Muslims. And yet, or Barbastro, I mentioned earlier on, the Muslims lost. The first big city they lost in Spain was Barbastro in 1063. And the outrages committed on Muslims, described by Christians themselves, are incredible. The mass slaughter, the mass rape, and so on. And yet Christians survived amongst Muslims untouched, unaffected. And this is really the aspect of tolerance, and we can go on about instances. You take schools. Schools were open to Muslims and non-Muslims as well. It was never hidden from anybody. And if you look at Muslim civilization, there is a great historian of science called George Sarton. And if you read his book, he got a huge book, 3 volumes, you look at the names of the scientists who thrived under this Islamic State, and you see all the faiths, the mixture, Turks, and as I said, Christians, people from Persia, Egyptians, Berbers, Africans. It was such a multicultural. The Christians themselves, when they used to visit Muslim cities, there is a very good quotation and good instance about the city of Palermo, for instance, in Sicily, Muslim Sicily. And there was a bishop, I forgot his name, I can't remember, and he came there and he made this description of Palermo, and he couldn't believe it. So many colors, so many faiths, so many ethnic groups living in that city and prospering together, and that amazed him. this spectacle, which was unique again to the Muslim world. And that you find whether in the East or in Spain or in Sicily and other parts of it. I think I can go on about this. We can discuss it through discussion for more detail. Finally, I would like to move on to part 3 of this talk, which is the exchange of science. Now, if you look at the Christian West, the situation that you compare the Christian West with the Muslim world in the Middle Ages, what was the Dark Ages for the Christian West was the age of glory for the Muslim world. Muslim civilization thrived from the 7th to the 13th century. This was the golden age of Muslim civilization. This compares to Dark Ages of Europe. This is what they refer. Sometimes they remove this period completely from history. What you have done is that everything, if you look at the situation in every respect, in terms of arts, architecture, sciences, as a political system, organization, legal practice. Yesterday they were having a talk about the impact of Muslim legal practice on the Christian West, because that's what we learned. Political organizations, finance, trade, navigation. The Muslim world was superior by centuries to the Christian West. And now, of course, I'm not going to tell you everything about how things changed and we got into the situation we are today. This would take hours. But I tell you briefly how the transfer began from the Muslim world to the Christian West. It's in the year is primarily the first transfers took place in the 11th century. The 11th century, two things happened. The Christians regained Sicily, and then they came across a civilization that was superior to theirs, much superior in every respect. And you all heard about how the Sicilian Norman kings promoted and protected the Muslim communities there, because they needed the Muslims in every respect, whether in relation to administration, finance, trade, agriculture, arts, and so on. You all heard of the Muslim scholar Al-Idrisi, for instance. For the Norman king to understand how the world looked at the time, because remember, the vision of the world then, the understanding of the world then, is equal to our understanding of space now, very limited. We know a bit about the moon and a few other planets. That was precisely at the time, people knew only about their immediate frontier. And for the Norman king, Roger, to understand how the world was, he asked the Muslim geographer Al-Idrisi, and he gave him a lot of money, gold and things on, and asked him to write a book and to draw a map for him, one you see on paper, flat and so on, and one to recreate the world, planisphere. And this is the first time, and that's why later on you will find that every discovery was made indirectly via Norman Sicily. Why? It's not by coincidence, it's because Al-Idrisi's work who explained everything and so on, how the world looked. Now, you have Sicily. One also place of contact and impact was Barbastro. I mentioned Barbastro already. This is the first big town lost by the Muslims to the Christians. When the Christian armies took Barbastro, they slaughtered nearly everybody, raped and killed the women, but they took one group of people, a couple of thousands of people who had knowledge and expertise, the craftsmen, and they distributed them all over the world, all over the Western world. Some went to France, some were taken to Byzantium, some were given to the Vatican and so on. And there, these people's expertise was used to learn to, so they started to make how to build like Muslims, to have some crafts in industry as Muslim, irrigation like Muslims and so on. So that was but the biggest contact took place in the 12th century. In the 12th century, you had two things, two major developments. First of all, you had the Crusaders in the East. They came to the East, and if you read, say, certain books, such as one written by a writer called Zoe Oldenburg in particular, she talks about the amazement of the Crusaders at what they saw in the East. They saw the industries, the trades, the sciences, the buildings, the arts, and so on. And they started copying this and taking from the Crusader East to the West. And many of these things they've taken, I can mention, for instance, take castle fortification. I give you some brief instances here. If you go to Wales, you will find some impressive castles there. One of them is Carnarvon, which I have myself seen, and one is Conway's Castle, which is now a bit empty. These were built by King Edward when he returned from the Crusades, and the same was done by Richard Lionheart. And you see every returning Crusader brought the same technique with him, the knowledge acquired from the East. Many historians would say to you, the Crusaders took the skills to do it. It's wrong because there never, no castle in the West dates from before the Crusades. All of them dates from the Crusades onwards. And all, by some coincidence, the Western castles have been erected in places by returning crusaders. Wherever the crusader returned, you have the castle. And the same thing with windmills, the same thing you have with industries, sugar industries, textiles, and I can go on about many industries which were acquired from the from the East, plus some sciences as well. But the role of Spain, I go back to it, this was crucial. I told you about the city of Toledo earlier on, how it was taken in 1085. Before the city of Toledo was taken, Toledo, I told you also about the Reyes of Taifa, the local rulers. The city of Toledo was in the hands of what we call the Banu Dinun. It was a Berber dynasty who controlled Toledo. They were from North Africa. And these people had the most thriving library because they had a wonderful ruler called the Mamun who loved sciences and so on and promoted them. So when the Christians came in, they found these wonderful libraries there with Muslim learning. So the first and most important scientific translation in history, the biggest, the Muslims did translate some Greek works, but never have such translation work taken such proportions as it did in Toledo. They came in scholars from all over the West, descended on Toledo, where they could find the riches of the Muslim world. And there they found all these books in Arabic, and they used translators, whether generally the Jewish translators, because the Jews could use both languages, they were the intermediaries, and they also used some Christians who understood a bit of Arabic, or some Muslims who understood a bit of Latin and so on, or some local languages. So this huge translation work went for a long time in the city of Toledo of Spain, which used to be the capital. And there were the biggest works of Muslim scholarship were translated by people such as Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn al-Haytham, Razi, Ibn Sina, and so on. The monuments of Muslim translation took place there. Before I go on about the role of Spain, I would like to make a little detour because there was also another impact from North Africa, which happened earlier on. The birth of European mathematics comes from North Africa, from the Algerian city of Béjaïa. The first major European mathematician, Leonardo Fibonacci, he learned his mathematics in Béjaïa, and his book is derived from mainly Muslim learning, and he was taught by his Muslim teachers in Béjaïa. There is another place that also played a very crucial part in the dissemination of learning, and that's the city of Al-Qayrawan in Tunisia. The city of Al-Qayrawan was the first university, and it was very, very famous and very powerful for its scientific learning. And what happened was a man called Constantine the African, who was Tunisian born, at some point he was either taken prisoner or whatever. You see, history is not too clear whether he escaped or was taken prisoner. Very likely he was taken to a prisoner. And he took with him vast learning from the city of Qayrawan, the medicinal learning. And then he translated it with helpers in Salerno and Monte Cassino, the area there, southern Italy. And after Constantine's translation, you had the first university in the Christian West came to the world, and that's the University of Salerno, where Constantine the African, who took the learning from Al-Qayrawan, did his translations. So this was Salerno, thrived in the 11th and 12th century. So when you have what you have, therefore, in the 11th, 12th century, you have all these getting together, learning from Béjaïa, mathematics I mentioned, learning from the East, the Crusaders, learning from Toledo, the translations, and from Al-Qayrawan being translated, and suddenly you have this great revival in the Christian West in the 12th and the 13th century. So when you read about the 12th and 13th century Renaissance in the West, it didn't happen by accident, as some Western historians today would tell you. They suddenly tell you it happened by accident, that things. They never tell you that wherever there was contact with the Muslim world, there was change. They don't tell you that whichever part had the contact with the Muslim world changed in that particular science it took from the Muslim world and so on. I can elaborate on this. But when the contact, therefore, was made with the Muslim world in all parts, North Africa, as I said, translations in Salerno, the Crusades, Sicily, and above all in the city of Toledo, where the big translations took place of sciences, you had this great revival of the Western world. And suddenly, you had the beginning of universities in the Christian world, you had the first great men of learning, you had the first organizations, the first great buildings, the first changes in architecture, castle fortifications, windmills, the first industries, advanced techniques, and all these were even stronger in the two parts that were under Muslim domination, or three parts that were under Muslim domination: Sicily, Portugal, and Spain. It is not by coincidence again, as some Western historian would tell you, that by some coincidence, it's the countries that were under Muslim rule that were the most powerful, and they remained the most powerful. And it is not again by coincidence that it was Spain and Portugal who made the greatest discoveries, because it was they again, because the Muslims were in those parts, they had the learning that the Muslims, it's the same thing with the Normans. They were the greatest navigators because, as I mentioned earlier on, they used the learning mainly from Idrisi and other Muslim sources and so on. And so this impact went on 12th, 13th century. I wouldn't elaborate what happened in the Muslim world. The Muslim civilization I was talking about in the earlier seminar today was destroyed in the 13th century. So what you have in the 13th century, you have suddenly Europe being on the ascendancy and the Muslim world beginning to descend. And then the processes went on amplifying, and suddenly from the 13th century onward, you've got the gap beginning to widen and widen. And when the Americas were discovered, the Christian West or Europe had more resources to finance its wars and its industries more than the Muslim world, and the Muslim world kept declining. The Ottomans played a big part in defending the Muslim world militarily, but it was a difficult thing. I mean, if it wasn't for Ottoman intervention, the Muslim world could have been even wiped out even earlier than during the colonial period. So it lasted, the Muslim world kept declining until the colonial era arrived, and then colonization made the bad situation worse. And then we had independence recently, and we've been trying to do something since independence. Some would say nothing, some would say great things. I leave that to you. Alhamdulillah, so that's inshallah my summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salahuddin, for such a fascinating and fact-filled presentation. I think we've got some time for questions. If you'd just like to put your hands up, I think I can see the lady in the blue scarf, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
You said earlier in your talk that the Muslim states were divided into 30 sections.
That's in Spain.
What was the real core reason for that such a big split?
It happened after the breakup of central rule. As I said to you, there was the Umayyad dynasty ended. There was a little boy who was the last Umayyad heir to the throne. He was protector. He had his vizier Ibn Amir, who became al-Mansur, great man, absolutely. He has great history, kept Muslim Spain united. However, at the death of al-Mansur, his son replaced him, but his son wasn't. When you read through Islamic history, you will find that generally father and son they belong to different molds. And then his son was very weak, and you had troubles and divisions and dissensions, and all divisions reappearing, and there was no powerful central figure to unite the thing. And so the country is united, and you have petty rivalries about local rulers. Everybody wanted his independence and so on, and his wealth. And that's why Muslim Spain collapsed into these 30 or so independent states called the Reyes de Taifas early in the 11th century. And they were also what they did. Not only they split, they started fighting each other, and sometimes making alliances with Christian armies. In fact, the Christians were very happy with that, and they did encourage them to fight each other. And then, you see, as a good historian, I think it's Lane Poole said, the Christian king wanted to give enough rope to Muslim rulers to hang themselves. And so and that's how they began losing and it's only when they were all threatened with extinction, then they called the Almoravids, the Morabitun from Morocco, to intervene. And if it wasn't for the Morabitun, Muslim Spain would have been completely lost in the 11th century after the rise of the typhoid.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Gentleman in the red shirt at the front.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, Captain.
There's a writer in Spain called Osama who denies that Tariq is the one who opened Spain.
Yeah.
Is that true or not?
Yeah, the Muslim entry into Spain was led by two. Tariq ibn Ziyad was the first one. He was the leader, all historical, maybe one or two exceptions would do it. Maybe he must have sent other of his generals in different directions. But the two leading generals of the Muslim armies going to Spain were Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr. Musa ibn Nusayr came, he was also a great Muslim general, and he played a great part in that. But Tariq ibn Ziyad definitely, because all historical sources also talk about the stirring speech that Tariq gave to his soldiers. He's famous for he came with a small band of soldiers, I think it's about 12,000 army, and in facing them were the Visigoths with an army over 100,000, but demoralized and divided, but also and the Muslims were quite united, and they had belief. You will go into Muslim history, belief in Muslims, what they did was powerful and very strong, and helped them a lot in those times. Anyway, and Tariq ibn Ziyad had the Muslim boats burned, and he said to them, now you've got nowhere to escape. You've got the sea behind you and an enemy ready to slaughter you, and you've got nothing except your weapons. And so they had to fight, and they did fight, and they did register at La Guadalet place one of the greatest victories known in history. An inferior army slaughtering a much superior army. But Tariq ibn Ziyad was the main one.
Is it true that the ogal, the black ogal that the Gulf people wear,
Yeah.
is it a sign of sadness of losing Spain?
Wallahi, akhi, I can't answer you on this. I wouldn't be able to answer you this question. So,
Okay, so the lady in white just on the right-hand corner, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for a very concise history, which is very good. Obviously, we know the Crusaders went over to the Middle East not to fight for their religion, but it was for the economic wealth of that part of the world. Do you, obviously, afterwards, when all the craftsmen and everything moved on, the East was poorer. Do you think the oil wealth of the East could have been used in a much better way to bring the Muslims together? And also the second part is, coming from the tolerance, which was very obvious at that time, is there, and I'm very reluctant to say that, is there racism within the Islamic world?
you mean racism?
Yes.
Yeah. I would like to answer the first bit in relation to Muslim wealth in the East. What you were mentioning about the Crusaders going there for yes, that played a big part, because you see what they did to motivate the Christian armies. There were many factors. Briefly, I won't bother you with the Crusades too much, but the Pope who launched the Crusades in 1095 from the city of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II, what he justified it. He made a big speech, and he talked about Muslim crimes. He invented them. He made a long speech talking about how the Muslims were slaughtering the Christians, opening their bellies and raping their women, burning their places, destroying their churches, and so on. So he was stirring the crowds as the younger of the Muslim barbarians, and the Christians then didn't know who these Muslims. So what they heard, they believed. And so you had hundreds of thousands going there to seek revenge from those Muslims. But the Pope had other reasons. He knew this was, as I mentioned earlier on, he knew this was the best time to invade the Muslim world, because the Muslim world, where they were fighting between each other and divisions, and the Christian had already registered successes in Spain, as I mentioned, Barbastro, Toledo, and they had reconquered Sicily. So they said this is the best time to deal with the Muslims in the East and to regain the holy sites. So he had to invent Muslim crimes in his speech. So he used some little robberies and some instances left and right to make these Muslim crimes terrible things to justify the invasion. But there were also economic reasons. The Pope and his armies were financed by the city-states. The city-states of Pisa, Venice, and so on. They wanted to take over Muslim wealth, Muslim trade, because at the time, trade and wealth belonged to the Muslims, not like, in fact, now it's natural resources. But at the time, the biggest navies, the biggest industries, the richest parts belonged to the Muslims. So the cities invested and encouraged the Pope and said, we'll back you, we'll finance your armies, your boats. In fact, the Crusaders were taken by the boats of those cities to go to the east. Some of them came by land as well. Anyway, the princes who led the Crusades were also interested in the good lands of Syria and Palestine. Palestine and Syria then, well, they were renowned as the land of milk and honey and wealth, and they were amazed at the industries there, the farms, the land. So all the leaders of the Crusades, some of them like Bohemond, Tancred, and so on, they wanted to go there, kill the Muslims, and take all their good lands. And so there was the wealth factor played a major part in it, I agree, and it motivated. However, the excuse given by the Pope, as I said, was the mass slaughter of the Christians and so on. And I can't go on about other excuses because, as I said, this was the best time to get rid, to finish the Muslims and so on. But mainly the economic factor and the military factor were there, and they only used the crimes as an excuse. In relation to racism and thing, is it the second thing? Again, I would like to, it's another long subject, but fascinating. I tell you this anecdote. There is this woman, Lady Montague. She came to the Muslim East. She traveled to the Muslim to Najd. She went there in late 18th century, I think. And there she sat. And she was amazed by one thing. She was amazed by the fact that there was, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm not used to talking to microphones, so anyway, thank you. We are going to beat them over there. So all of them will hear too. Now, yes, I think I better keep it away. So, what I was saying is, Lady Montague was fascinated by this fact. She saw these rich Arabs, powerful Arabs, sitting in admiration and listening to this black governor, and she couldn't believe it. How could this man, black man, could be there talking to these people and they listening gracefully and admiring him, and that was a sight. She writes about it in such amazement, a wonder, because remember, this was the age of the slave trade in the Christian West. And there she comes to the Muslim world and she finds Muslims, as far as racism, if you study Muslim history, you will find that most Muslim rulers, including in the Abbasid Caliphate and the Mamluks and other, I will talk about the Ottomans in a minute, they were all formerly the sons of slaves, or their mothers were slaves, or they themselves were slaves. Some of the best and greatest Muslim rulers. You've got one of them who is very famous, who is Baybars. And he was a slave as a child. And you take the Ottomans, the color black was the symbol of power and strength and honor and so on. Uthman, the first, the Ottomans derived from Uthman. He was black himself. And this was, you see, our history is filled with instances of people of different colors who were not just nicely treated, who became the most powerful men in history. You've got somebody, Moulay, I was reading about him, Ismail of Morocco. Recently, I was just reading about him 2 or 3 weeks ago. And the power, and again, his mother was an African slave, and he became great king. His powers, one of the best kings Morocco ever had. And you go the same thing when the Tunisians went, because Sicily was taken for the Muslim by the Tunisians, is the Aghlabid dynasty, who sent the armies to take Sicily. And Ziyadat Allah, he sent an army that was commanded by Africans. When they went into Palermo and the Muslim armies, they were amazed at these Arabs and Christians and for many people who had converted, blonde people, and African leaders, all colors, as they used to call them, Sudanese, taking Sicily and taking over. And I was describing for you the cities of Muslim Sicily earlier on, that amazed that bishop or religious figure. He couldn't believe what he saw. And the same sight in Cordoba, in other places. Racism has never, ever, ever been Islamic. Although now you've got some modern historians who are trying to revert history and to change, to turn everything upside down. And so, but history, there are facts and they can be checked. Everybody here can check them. And you just need to count and see how many rulers of our dynasties came from slave origin or from African origin. You will be amazed by the fact. And not just the rulers, scientists as well. And this is the great thing about Islam. It has never been, mind you, there are many Western scholars who do recognize that. You read, for instance, somebody like Lévi Provençal, or even some people who are hostile to Islam but still admit this, like Von S. or Kung, I don't know how you pronounce, I think Kung would be the better pronunciation. Of course, and other scholars who do recognize this great aspect of Muslim civilization and the absence of intolerance and racism.